So as you guys might know by now, Dana White's Contender Series is going to be kicking off this year in the middle of August. August 13th, I believe, is going to be week 1 of Contender Series 2024, and some fights have already been announced. So I'm going to have to start getting out my prospects that should be on the show videos out pretty quickly, as I do think we are, over the next few weeks, going to find out all of the fighters that actually are on the show, and also some of the fights that have been made. I will make separate videos on the fights that have been announced. As I record this one, I know of 3 fights, and I think I will just talk about all 3 fights in one video. But this one here is going to be the lightweight that I think it should be on the show. And as you guys know, lightweight is one of the most stacked weight classes, not just in the UFC, but also in MMA in general. So of course, I've got a pretty comprehensive list here. And of course, because there are hundreds of really good quality lightweights, I'm sure I'm going to miss a few. But if I do miss someone that must be on this list, please let me know in the comments below. Starting off, as always, I'm just going to talk about someone that I think could return to the show. And yes, this is a random one. He's, I believe, the only... No, I've got a couple of returning fighters, actually. Vinicius Sensi is the first one. I know it's super random. This guy come out of absolutely nowhere and beat this guy called Sam Patterson. And prior to that, he hadn't fought for over a year. Super random, lost to Sam Patterson, but then after that, he just beat one of the better prospects in Africa, Yabna Intachala, who was 10-1 and was actually on the list. But then, of course, because Vinicius Sensi beats him, he's on the list now. So that's just kind of how that went. George Hardwick, I think, is due to make a return at some point. He had a fight that was booked against Lucas Clay. That fight didn't end up happening, so not really too sure what's going to go on with him in the future, but I do expect to see George Hardwick come back. I mean, I feel like he, although he hasn't fought since and he hasn't won since, I feel like he's done enough on the regional scene to at least deserve it. And honestly, he probably should have been signed to the UFC straight up, but I guess the loss to Abdul Karim Al Sawadi hasn't aged super well. So maybe he wasn't as good as a lot of us thought he was in the first place, but I think that George Hardwick is a guy that you definitely could bring back. Valentin Benev is a very interesting fighter because I don't know if he's still even fighting. He's 19-0 and he's never fought anybody good. So what do you do with him? You can't just sign him directly to the UFC. I mean, you probably could, but I'd rather you just kind of used him on the Contender Series to test somebody else or test him. I don't know, man. I mean, this guy just absolutely dominated, I believe, the Bulgarian regional scene, and he hasn't, I don't know, he's been inactive. I've no idea what is up with him, but I had to bring him up because he is 19-0. The next fighter is Paul Hughes. I think that you're probably going to see Paul Hughes signed directly to the UFC to make his debut on the Manchester card. Paul Hughes is deserving of a shot. Obviously, if he's not going to get signed directly, you could put him on the Contender Series, I guess. But he has dominated a lot of the regional scene on Cage Warriors and in Europe. Of course, he does have the loss to Jordan Vasenic, but then he absolutely dominated Vasenic in the rematch to get that win back. And after that, he's beaten a couple pretty good guys by KO in the very first round. And Fabiano Silva actually took that fight on very short notice. I think Paul Hughes had like 5 different opponents booked within like a couple of weeks. So a lot of people went through until Fabiano Silva actually took the fight. Aside from that, he's got a win over Morgan Charrier, who is in the UFC right now and is finding his own success in the promotion. So Paul Hughes, he's big news. I was going to say he's a big deal. Definitely worth signing. Rudy Garcia is from Peru. The UFC has been signing a lot of fighters from Peru recently, and he is 20-3. He's also had a fight recently, as in last weekend, but I don't know if he won. I'm going to assume he won because his opponent was 20-16, and he has beaten better opponents than that in the past. Once again, he's just absolutely cleaned out the local scene in Peru. There's really no one else for him to fight except for international talent, so get him in the UFC or put him on the Contender Series 20-3 record. Kabanchabek Abdelasam Ulu, 21-3, and he is out of his ACB and ACA contract at the moment, to my understanding, as he is fighting for Brave, and he's beating good fighters. In fact, he's got a win over Lucas Martins, who, if you guys don't know, was in the UFC at one point. I was about to say he was in the UFC at one point, wasn't he? And he was. He lost to Mirsad Bektic, and he lost to Darren Elkins, who had a great fight against each other. So he's beaten a former UFC fighter in Lucas Martins. And then after that, he has gone on to beat some pretty decent opponents. 12-4, 15-4, 15-3. Lucas Martins was 22-6 at the time. Kavichabek Abdulislam Ulu definitely should be on the Contender Series or signed to the UFC. He's also from Kyrgyzstan. The UFC wants more fighters from Kyrgyzstan. The UFC also wants more fighters from lightweight, and there's not really more deserving lightweight prospects out there from Mexico than Christian Perez, who is 13-1 and is fighting very good competition over at Combate Global, and once again he's beaten decent guys. Dumar Roa, I believe it was actually the fighter that just fought Rudy Garcia that I talked about, but he's beaten a 4-0 opponent. And Bruno Canetti, who is the brother of Guido Canetti, former UFC fighter there. 11-4 opponent, 10-5 opponent. Not the best in the world, but he is finishing a lot of these guys. And he is only 24 years old, is probably very much deserving of a Contender Series opportunity. Ernesto Rodriguez is from Cuba. I don't think the UFC has anyone from Cuba on their roster. He fights out of Extreme Couture, so he's in the United States, and he's fighting at United States events such as the LFA and Tough Enough. Recently just beat an 11-2 opponent by knockout, beat a 6-1 opponent on Uriah Faber's competition. So I feel like you could see one of the first Cuban fighters ever in Ernesto Rodriguez in the UFC. He's also only 26 years old. Welterweight, it says. I'm pretty sure he fought at lightweight. Otherwise, I might have just put him on the wrong list like an absolute idiot. He fought at 170 most recently. I am an idiot. But anyway, let's move on. Alex Sanchez is another fighter from Mexico that is a lightweight with a 14-3 record. He has once again beaten pretty decent opponents. Had a fight booked against Anthony Figueroa, and if I'm not mistaken, that was a good opponent. Decent opponent. 4-1 opponent or 4-0 opponent at the time, I guess. Has beaten good guys, 18-5 win, 7-4 win, 4-1. Has beaten some good guys, has lost to some pretty decent guys as well, but overall a 14-3 record. The UFC wants more fighters from Mexico. Need I say more? Lucas Clay is on here because he was actually meant to fight George Hardwick, so I thought why not just book the fight against George Hardwick on the Contender Series. That's kind of it, to be honest. Milos Jesic is actually signed to Octagon, and I think he might be committed to an Octagon tournament right now, but if he's not, we have seen fighters from Octagon on the Contender Series before. Matias Pinhas is an example. They also had that Brazilian guy who lost to Oban Elliott, Kai Cabrito, who I think was a champion for Octagon. Milos Jesic is 17-3, beating decent opponents, has fought around the place, fought for Polish promotions before, fought for Serbian promotions before, fought for the Czech Republic promotion in Octagon, so pretty much this guy has been around the European regional scene. He's beaten good guys. He's even fought in bare-knuckle boxing because that's just something that he likes to do in his free time, I guess. He should be on the Contender Series. And once again, I don't think the UFC's got anyone from Montenegro in their promotion, so definitely the first ever fighter from that country could be quite cool. Samuel Silva is 12-4, but he most recently beat an 18-4 opponent in Anderson Ferreira, who was a guy that I was looking forward to potentially putting on this list, but I guess the younger guy won, which is probably better. So you've got Samuel Silva, 12-4, with a couple good wins. Rodrigo Lidio was actually on the Contender Series, and he actually lost to Mateusz Rebecki, who's a pretty decent fighter. Maybe you could bring him back, maybe, but probably not. At the end of the day, Samuel Silva, he's beaten good guys. He's beaten a guy that's even been on the Contender Series before. I think you could put Samuel Silva on the show. William Starks is a top guy out of the USA. He has been beating some very good guys recently and is on a little bit of a win streak. He beat Johnny Hopper, who was a prospect at one point, the 13-7 Manny Muro in the LFA, and he has once again lost to a couple guys, but he's had a couple fights booked against Jordan Griffin, who was in the UFC, if it's the same Jordan Griffin, and Malquazel Costa, who is in the UFC. He also holds a win over Vyacheslav Borchev as well, who was in the UFC. And before that, IMMAF Amateur World Champion in MMA, 2 times, I believe, one over Alex Martinez, who is 2 over Alex Martinez, who was in PFL, and Joseph Luciano is a very, very good prospect himself, and so is Benjamin Bennett, very good prospect as well. So William Starks, definitely a guy with a pretty storied career so far. Richie Miranda was 8-1. He's 5'9". He's also a lightweight, beating decent guys in the LFA. He is a wrestler for the most part. Couldn't quite get it done against Keegan Genrich, but Keegan Genrich is a pretty decent guy in his own right from the USA. It makes sense. Now to get on to a couple guys from the USA, Quillan Salkeed, I think is a guy you probably will see on the Contender Series, as the UFC knows who this guy is. He was actually meant to be on the road to UFC tournament as part of like a bonus fight, but his opponent Jae-Hyung Park was pulled out of this fight to then take on short notice, Shin Haraguchi as his opponent. Bahati Bati Balate, who is also on this list, pulled out of that fight. So the UFC knows who Quillan Salkeed is. Since then, he's beaten a couple guys, 3-1, 4-1. Don Marfan, I believe, is actually going to be fighting for the title at featherweight, or he's going to be in some sort of tournament, if I'm not mistaken. But either way, Quillan Salkeed got a couple good wins on his record. He's definitely a guy that the UFC knows who he is. He should be and could be on the Contender Series this year. Another guy from Australia is Harry Webb. I know he is only 4-0, but he is 7-0 as an amateur, and he did just knock out Abdullah Bieda, who I think is a guy that definitely could have found himself in the UFC if he beat Harry Webb. Harry Webb knocked him out in the first round. I know he's only 4-0, but there's a chance. You know, the UFC does like to sign guys that are somewhat inexperienced sometimes, so we'll see how Harry Webb can go there. Joel Oliveira is a guy here who is 14-4 on a very big win streak, just defeated the 9-0 fighter here Lazaro, 8-2, and 17-8. Bruno Reverso, he's from Brazil. The UFC wants more fighters from Brazil. A lot of first round finishes as well. I think you could probably find him in the UFC. I think I had Joel on my featherweight list. I don't even know, to be honest with you. Windri Patilima is from Indonesia. He probably is the best and most UFC-ready fighter out of Indonesia, in my opinion. I know he has been fighting at 170 in Indonesia, but he did fight at 155 against Shin Haraguchi. And in my opinion, although he did get dominated in that matchup, he looked like he fits 155 pounds very well. He looked like he was in very good shape. He's just kind of beating the best of the best that they can find him in Indonesia. He took on a 6-0 guy, beat him 6-1, 4-0. 9-3 in Indonesia for One Pride MMA. Indonesian MMA is getting very big at the moment. There's a lot of fans of the UFC and of MMA in Indonesia, so I do think it would be intelligent of the UFC to potentially give someone like Windri Patilima the opportunity and just kind of see how it goes. Marcelo Marquez is 9-0 from Brazil, and he is, well, he's 9-0. Hasn't really beaten the best guys, but he's got a couple very solid wins. Aside from that, a couple guys that aren't that great. I mean, he's got a matchup against a 3-3 opponent, and he's 9-0. I'm assuming it's a short notice replacement. But yeah, he could be 10-0 potentially soon. So, I mean, that's kind of it. Aiz Karov, he trains out of China. He was born in Tajikistan. The UFC wants more fans from China, and people from Tajikistan absolutely love MMA and absolutely love the UFC. You just can't go wrong. And once again, Aiz Karov is just dominating the Chinese regional scene. I know he lost to Balajin, but Balajin's pretty good. He recently won the tournament against Ali Mulati Bieki, who's a good fighter. I think he actually just lost recently himself to nobody. He just beat Balajin, actually. Never mind. I'm an idiot. But Aiz Karov, I mean, just give him a shot. Maybe he's been fighting at 145 as well at some point, so maybe he could be a featherweight. One, Pablo Vera is 7-0 and only 20 years old at lightweight. All of his wins are by finish, and once again, not really been beating the best guys, but that is what the Contender Series is for, is to give these guys a test. He did just knock out Marcos Bruno, who was 6-2. That's his best win, and he knocked him out in the second round in the LFA. Only 20 years old. I mean, the UFC has been signing some young guys recently. Jefferson Asimo is 11-0 from Brazil. I mean, do I really need to say much more than that? He's been beating alright guys as well. I mean, 5-0, 12-3 Italo Gomes, who I think is really good, and 8-0 at the time, Gabriel Costa. Let's just make it happen. C1 Park. There is no Road to UFC lightweight tournament, which is why I have quite a few Asian fighters at the end of this video. C1 Park is one of them. 6-0 from South Korea. Peace and decent guys. Had an amateur career as well. Would technically be 9-0 if you included some of these matchups, which are modified rules. I'm not too sure how modified they are, but he's been knocking people out silly in the first round over there in South Korea. Looks like he's been on a pretty decent run for himself. At 22 years old, is the kind of guy I think the UFC would be quite interested in. Now I have Nate Jennerman, who's 17-5, and you may recognize him from the Ultimate Fighter show. He did lose to Roosevelt Roberts in only 8 seconds, but since then he's beaten a guy with a losing record. I know it's not much to go off, but trust me, the UFC doesn't mind bringing people back from the Ultimate Fighter that have already been. So they don't mind bringing people to the Contender Series that have already been on Tough. I would half expect Nate Jennerman to show up, is all I'm going to say. Xin Yang is from China. The last few guys I've got are from China. Xin Yang is 14-5. As I've said in the past, the UFC wants more fighters from China on their roster. He's lost to Archie Lung, who... Wait, that was at 135. What's he doing at 155? He's a featherweight. We will move on. Archie Lung is in the UFC. Let's move on. Batti Batti. Okay. Is a lightweight because he fought at the lightweight tournament last year on the road to UFC. In my opinion, robbed Won Bin Ki. But it is what it is. It is what it is. And then he pulled out of his fight against Shin Haraguchi. And then he beat a guy that was 0-1. I mean, what is this guy getting up to? Before that, though, he was fighting for the LFA. Robbed Ryan Leninger. Yeah, I'm not really selling you guys on him, am I? But the point is, I believe he does actually train in the United States. He is a guy that has been trying to make a run into the UFC. I think that with the fact that there is no Road to UFC tournament this year, you could put Batti Ballati on the show. And then you're going to be very disappointed with this final one because it is Yibu Jelli. Just once again, the UFC wants more fighters from China. I know Yibu Jelli looked like he is not really a great fighter at all against Koya Kanda. But once again, I mean, he is just absolutely run through the regional scene in China. So Contender Series, I guess, for him. That's it. I apologize to end the video on a bit of a sour note, but trust me, there are some really good prospects in that video. I'm actually going to be recording all of my future videos at once. So this one all the way to the heavyweight, I'm recording in one session. So gonna be fun. I think I'm going to record about 8 videos tonight. So looking forward to it. I'll see you guys in the next one.